I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. Could say that for many things. Hello everybody and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've watched before. So today I'm going to be talking about the very basics of watercolour paint, and I mean basic 101. I'm going to be talking about bottled watercolour paint, palettes and also pencils, those three mediums, and then I'm also going to be telling you what sort of brushes that you can use to get different effects. It's something that if you are starting out it could be useful to you, so keep on watching. On top of this, I'm also going to be telling you what I like to use and what I've found works the best to get the best effects from watercolours, and what is the most functional and works the best on an everyday life. So I hope you find this video interesting, and let's get into it. So here I'm just laying out the main ingredients of this video. Here I've got watercolour pencils, watercolour tube paints and also watercolour palette. As well as this, I'm going to be pairing it with some masking tape, 2 pots of water. One of those pots will be used for cleaning your brush and the other will be for lubricating the paint. I've also got an array of brushes here which I'll go into more detail in later in the video, as well as some kitchen roll for drying the brush, a plate for mixing the colours, and also this Dalla & Roni Aquafine Smooth paper, which is a cold pressed one and I think it's the best, but you can use whatever watercolour paper that you would like. I've also got a white gel pen and a black fine liner here, which I'll go into more detail about later on in this series, but today I just thought I'd show you it as my main ingredients within watercolour and throughout this video. Before actually going into this section, I'm just laying the page out here with some masking tape so I can show you the 3 watercolour paint and how they compare to each other. To start out with, I'm going to be using the Pallet watercolour paint. Essentially, this paint is a dried watercolour which you need to lubricate to make it functional. So to get straight into the Pallet watercolour, as I said previously, this is a hard base paint which you have to lubricate before use. The best thing about this paint is that it comes in one singular package, so you can take it anywhere. It's easily transportable. You can just pop it in your bag and you've got all the colours that you're going to need. The main difference that I find between this paint and the tube-based paint is that the tube-based paint is slightly more opaque than the palette-based paint. This is only because the tube-based paint comes out as a solid colour. You are not going to get any more pigmented than the colour that comes out of the tube, and once that colour is out of the tube you do usually have to lubricate it. However, you can also use it as its primary source, but it will also be very thick when you are using it. As you can see here, I am just mixing some of the blue colours onto the plate. You can also do this by mixing the colour directly onto the lid, which is also really useful if you are painting out and about. I am slightly biased towards the palette based paints because I use them so much and I find them so easy to use. If you are using a tube based paint, then it does mean that you do have to carry a plate round with you basically, or a mixing palette. Now with this base paint you can actually get a really fine colour. You can get a really deep colour, you can also get a very sheer colour. So there's a whole range of colour that you can get with this, and it is great. And as I say, the only difference that I can really see, the tube paint is slightly more opaque initially on the page. So to summarise this paint, its benefits are it's very compactable, it's easy to travel, it's easy to put in your bag, and also all the colours are there and you can mix them within the palette itself. The cons are it's not quite as opaque as the tube paint. However, it all depends on the standard really of watercolours that you're buying, but generally it's not quite as opaque, but you are going to build the layers and you are going to get to a very similar level. And I don't think there's really any other cons for using palette paint in my opinion. So now we're moving on to the tube based paints, and as I said previously in this video, it comes pre-mixed. However, you do usually have to lubricate it with some water to create the different colours that you are looking for. Now I'm going to show you on the page what it looks like if you just put the paint on it, and it almost comes out like an acrylic when you put it on the page. However, it is still got that consistency of water to it. It doesn't have the plasticity of acrylic paint. And as you can see here, it does produce quite a difference in colour compared to the blue above it. It is a very opaque colour that it is producing. However, if you do water it down, it does produce that more watercolour-like paint. I personally prefer the appearance of the palette paint because it does appear more like a watercolour paint rather than an acrylic paint, as I'm just more biased to watercolour paint at the moment. I'm going through a watercolour paint phase. But really, as you can see, there isn't much difference, and you can actually do all the things with palette-based paint and tube-based paint as each other. You can do the same with palette-based paint as tube-based paint, and with tube-based paint as palette-based paint, if that makes any sense at all. You can still create all the layers that you want to create with tube-based paint. One thing that I like to do to combine the two is if I run empty on one of my little trays in my palette, for all the paints, I've used up all the paint, then I take one of the tube paints and squeeze it in to the palette, and it creates basically the same thing as buying a new little plastic tray full of the hardened paint. So that really just proves how much of a difference there is. And then within 24 to 48 hours, that paint is going to be dried and it's going to act the exact same. The pros and cons of this one. So I'd say the pros are that you can get that really, really deep colour. If you're doing a landscape and you are creating shadows, then get that black paint and, just go in there with the shadows and create those really severe lines. The cons are that it's not very transportable. You are going to have to take a plate to mix it on. It doesn't have the same accessibility as a palette paint. And finally, we move on to the pencil watercolour paints. Now, immediately as I'm colouring this onto the page, you can see how sheer this colour is going to be, and it is just completely different to the other two mediums because you're using something that almost like a watercolour palette paint, but you're brushing it onto the page and then applying the water to it afterwards. So that's basically how it works. You can do the same thing with pastels. You can create some things that are quite detailed, and I definitely recommend this medium if you're coming to watercolour after using a pencil medium. If you're used to using pencils, pastels, and you want to sort of break yourself into watercolours, then I definitely try using this medium first, because you have to blend the colours by overlaying them with this. You can't mix them on the palette and then apply them to the page. So it is very similar in that respect, but you can blend the two colours together. Here I'm just applying the water and creating the colour, and that is pretty much as dark a blue I'm going to get. Now, these are Derwent pencils, I believe, so they're not bad quality pencils, but personally I never use them because I just don't like them as much as other watercolours. But as you can see, it is very easy to blend, and the accessibility and tube-based paint is very easy because you don't have to mix a colour on anything but the page you're drawing on, so it is really good in that respect as well. One thing that you can't really do very well with this paint is layers. You're sort of going to be going in with one layer because of the opacity levels. You can't create a darker colour, but if you're doing mixed medium with different watercolours, then this could work great for you. So I'm going to dive into the pros and cons of this one. So I'd say the pros are that it is easy to transport, easily accessible. It is almost like a transitional medium, so you can move into it from pencils or pastels and feel comfortable using it. It is very easy to pick up and use, so those are the main pros that I would give it. The cons being that the opacity level isn't that great, and you do have to mix the colour on the page, which I'm not a massive fan of, but if you don't mind doing that, then this is a great one to start out with. My favourite thing ever, and I'm not even being sarcastic, we're looking at brushes. Brushes. And today we're going to be looking at 6 different brushes, which I believe are the most important brushes that you need to buy setting out your watercolour career. And the first brush that we're going to be looking at is a number 1 brush, but technically it is the smallest brush in the range of brushes that you are buying. But this paintbrush is great for getting details in, and in my opinion you don't really need anything smaller than this, because you can see by my video how small and how thick you can get the brush strokes on this one. So I definitely recommend getting something like this for your details. The second brush I'm looking at is again another round head brush, and it is a number 5. This one is a Della and Roni one, and you can create just a smaller streaks really with this if you're not applying too much weight to the brush, but you can also create these much fatter lines, and it's a great all-rounder brush. If I'm going to be picking one sort of small to medium range brush, I'm going to be going with this one because it just creates everything that I kind of need on a small scale painting. The next brush that we're going to be looking at is a flathead brush, and this one is size small. Again, with brushes it is very ambiguous to what size you are actually getting. This is great for adding depth to a painting and also covering the page. So if you're doing any kind of wash on a small area, then this is great. I really like to use flathead brushes if I'm using something that's got large areas that I need to fill in but also got some detail, because you can use the thinner end of the brush to create thinner strokes, as I've shown you, also the flat edge to create the thicker strokes. Now the next brush that I've got here is, this one needs a moment for its own, because this brush is the actual holy grail in brushes. It's a makeup brush, but it just works so well for me and for what I use it for. It's great for creating fur textures, and as a pet portrait artist I've got to create fur textures, so this little baby here just does the job so well because it's a very firm brush. You can get the same effect with the brush that I'm going to show you next, which is a fan brush, and it just means that the brushes in the brush are quite rigid and separated, so it can create this fur-like texture, but it also can create a very flat, dense colour, just like this. So this is the fan brush, and as you can see here, it does the same job pretty much. So, and these are very readily available. This fan brush, it is a 2/1 fan brush, so I'm sure you can probably get different sizes, but if you are trying to create fur and you just don't know how to do it, you need to use this, and it also works really well with layering. And the final brush that I am showing you today is a nice big washing brush. So this brush is a 1-inch brush, and it obviously is a flat brush, and it is just great for getting your backgrounds in. You can go up to any size with these sort of washing brushes, but I've picked a 1-inch one because it came in the set basically that I got for this, and it worked really well. So here are all the textures that you can see above and how they are slightly different to one another, and these are my go-to brushes that I use when I'm painting. You know, you've got everything from a very small brush to a very flat brush to brushes that create textures, and you honestly just don't need any more than this. And I actually managed to get most of these brushes all in one packet, but I will link below the set that I bought, and it was only about £6 or £7 on Amazon. I would just recommend getting these brushes to start out with, because you don't need to spend a fortune to get everything that you want to try for watercolour paint. Right, so that is the end of the video there. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. I'm going to do a series of these to bring you up from what sort of materials you need to how to use a paint essentially. I find these videos really useful. I mean, I wish I'd have watched something like this when I first started out with watercolour, because it is just good to know what to use, like the actual fundamentals of watercolour paint essentially. I will be doing more of these videos, so if you do like them then give it a like, and I hope it is useful to you, because as I say, I would have loved to have seen something like this starting out, because I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. Could say that for many things. Anyway, I hope to see you all soon, so goodbye.